In this lecture, I want to talk you through variables in Octopus Deploy. Variables are very important and very flexible in Octopus Deploy. Using variables, you can implement very complex deployment scenarios. In order to define project-specific variables, you have to go to your project, and in your project setting page, you have a tab called variables, and this is where you define your variables. Definition of variables can go very complicated, so we start with simple variable definition. So every variable has a name and a value at the bare minimum. You can add scope and other things as well. For now, let's say that we want to define a variable, and let's just create something very simple. We can say, for example, host name, and the value can be, for example, CICD demo.local, and we just save. So we created a variable that's very simple. Now, how do we refer to this value? So you always need obviously your variable name, and then you want to use this. You can use it basically anywhere within this project because we created this variable inside the project. For example, in the process of the project, if you remember, we had to define the host name, the binding of this website somewhere. If I find that, so the host was CICD demo.local. By doing this, we have basically hard-coded the hostname value. So if I deploy this website to, for example, test environment or to production environment, this hostname is not going to be valid because it's not a real domain name. So what we can do is that we can create a variable, and then based on the environment we are deploying this project to, we can change that variable's value. For example, when I'm deploying to dev environment, the value of the variable can be CICD demo.local. If I deploy this to, for example, production environment, the value can be mywebsite.com. So to refer to a variable, you always use with hashtag, curly bracket open, the name of the variable, and curly bracket closed. It's very simple, and you can always see it in this corner as well. So if I click on this, it brings up the list of variables. The top one is always the user defined ones, and then you see a whole bunch of other variables. These are called system variables, and they come with Octopus Deploy. We have a look at these very shortly. So to insert a variable, I can just click on it, and again, as you see, automatically I get the hashtag, curly brackets, and then the name of the variable, and I click on OK, and I click on save. So this is not going to change anything when I deploy, except that if I go to variable section and I change the value of this variable, then I'm going to create a different binding when I deploy the website without having to change my process. As I said, one example is that if I want to deploy this website to my dev environment, this CICD demo.local makes sense. But if I deploy this to production environment, then it has to be a real domain. So how do I control that? CICD demo.local only makes sense when I deploy this to dev environment. Therefore, it should not be in any other environments. That is called the scope. So every variable has name, value, and a scope. You can click on the scope, and you can define basically where this value makes sense. You can use any mix of these criteria. The basic one is the environment. So if I say the scope is dev environment, this value that I provided will not even exist in any other environments. You can, for example, say this value only makes sense when I deploy to IIS. We don't have binding in, for example, Nginx or Tomcat. You can use target. Again, I can say in Ubuntu, for example, we don't have such thing. We have it in web server. We can also define it with the process, or we can use, for example, channels. We haven't learned about channels yet, and we just have to click outside that box and save. Now, if I want to deploy this to a production environment, for example, I need basically a value for production environment as well, because this is the value that I would use in dev environment, but where is the value that I would use in a production environment? For that, you can add extra values for the same variable. So if I go to this line where the variable is defined and click on these three dots, I can see that there is a button called add value, and I can click on that. You can provide value for the same variable. For example, I can say www.mywebsite.com.au, for example, and I can define a scope, but then this time I can say, for example, this is in a different target like Ubuntu server, and if I deploy to Tomcat on Ubuntu server, then my website address is, for example, this. Or I don't have any other environments. I could say, for example, if I deploy to production, then use that environment. So you define the criteria for this variable value, and you can keep adding value by clicking on add value, or you can duplicate one of these values and just change them or delete them. So we can click on save. Now, depending on the criteria of your deployment, for example, what environment you are deploying to, what target or role you are using, any of these will be chosen. If you want more complicated configuration for a variable, let me delete this one. You can do this. You can click on the value and you see that there is open editor button in here. If you click on it, you can get more configuration options. For example, you can say that I'm not providing a text, I'm providing an AWS account or Azure account. We see this in Octopus Deploy level 2. You can provide description for your variable. And if you want a user to enter a value every time you make a deployment, you can click on prompt for value. Similar to TeamCity, when you prompt for a value, you can provide label, for example, host name, a description, and a control type. Default is text box, but you can have checkbox, drop down, multi-line text box, single line text box, which is default. If you provide, for example, drop down, then you can provide multiple options. Always the value comes first, then separated by a pipe, you can provide text. For example, I can say dev means development environment, something like this. Or we can say prod means production environment. You have this flexibility. It's very easy. All you need to do is basically to create a couple of variables and try these options to get a hang of it. It's not difficult to learn and understand. And if you click on done, then you will get the variable. For our case, we want just single line text box. Now, if I save, I get an error message, and that is that if you create a variable and you say that it has to be prompted, it has to be filtered by the environment only, nothing else. And that is because before you run the deployment, you only know about the environment, you don't know about roles and anything else. So if you say that my variable has to be prompted with this checkbox, then you can only limit it to environment, because before you deploy, you don't know much about other properties, and we can save. Now, if I create a release and I say deploy, you will see that parameters appear here. These are basically variables, and I will be prompted for a value. Because I said that my environment is dev, I get this value. If I had, for example, prod, then I would get that value that I specified for production. And then you can run your deployments and deploy. So I let you create some variables and practice, and then I will explain the system variables in the next lecture.